Formerly they ravaged the Gallic and German lands, but now they have renounced their innate savagery and received the preachers of truth in great numbers. They destroyed the altars of idols and built churches everywhere. This quote comes from Adam of Bremen, a cleric from the Archbishopric of Hamburg-Bremen, who chronicled the Christianization of Scandinavia in the late 11th century. It reflects the stark contrast between the raiding Norsemen of the Viking Age and the Christian kingdoms of the High Middle Ages. The Scandinavians are no longer just feared warriors from the north, they are becoming kingdoms, Christians, and players on the European stage. In this episode, we'll explore that transformation from pagan altars to parish churches, from Viking chieftains to crowned kings, and from scattered tribes to emerging realms. Welcome to the High Middle Ages. Let us start with some clarification of terms so that we can get a footing on where and specifically when we are. You've probably heard the terms the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, and the Medieval Era before. The Middle Ages is mainly an academic term today, but its origins lie in the age that came right after it, the Renaissance. The word Renaissance comes from French and Italian meaning renewal or reawakening. People during the Renaissance looked back at the previous centuries as a middle, mediocre, and dull period between their own time and the glory of the Roman Empire. We will get more into what the Renaissance was and meant later in this series. The Middle Ages actually consist of three, let's call them sub-ages: the early, high, and late Middle Ages. The early Middle Ages span from around 500 to 1000 AD, so our last episode covering the Viking Age falls into this period. This has long been referred to as the Dark Ages due to the misconception and bias that the age contained no progress and was just culturally stagnant. As we saw in last episode, that is at least one sea journey away from the truth. The High Middle Ages, circa 1000 to 1300 AD, and the subject of this video, saw the strengthening of monarchies and the Catholic Church, feudalism and manorialism. We'll get into what those systems were in a bit. This is the age where stories like Robin Hood and Ivanhoe take place. Think knights in shining armor, jousting, and colorful banners fluttering in the wind. Many fantasy stories, such as Game of Thrones, are set in a world inspired by this time period. Were the real Middle Ages as bloody and backstabby as Game of Thrones? Well, no. They were even worse. The War of the Roses, which inspired much of Game of Thrones, was just one of many brutal conflicts of this era. Lastly, we have the late Middle Ages, circa 1300 to 1500 AD, the time period we'll mainly cover in the next episode. This is an age marked by decline. Here we see instability in Europe, the Hundred Years' War between England and France, peasant revolts all over the place. The church also faced internal division, most notably the Western Schism, where rival popes vied for power. Then there's also that tiny little bump in the road known as the Black Death. The medieval era, on the other hand, is just a more romantic version of the Middle Ages and covers the same time period. Think medieval castles, medieval warfare, and so on. Note that we're rather loose with the dates. These ages, like most historical periods, are after the fact constructions. It's not as if you'd go to sleep one night in the High Middle Ages and wake up the next morning in the Late Middle Ages. Societal changes on this scale take time, quite a long time. and it's often hard to pin down exactly where one age ends and another age begins. The Middle Ages are also known for being a feudal society. In short, this means that while the king sat on the top, real power was often exercised locally by lords, like dukes and earls. These lords could divide their domains into smaller units, appointing lower nobles to govern them. It was a layered system of loyalty and landholding, where land was exchanged for military service and allegiance. We won't go into it much on this channel, but the Holy Roman Empire is a great example of this mincemeat type of rule going into overdrive. So, let's pick up where we left off last episode and see how the Nordic kingdoms began weaving themselves into the broader tapestry of medieval Europe. Last episode we covered the foundations of the kingdoms of Denmark and Norway. The sibling we didn't cover was Sweden, and there's a reason for that. It's quite a bit more complicated than the other two. In the late 900s, what is now southern Sweden consisted of smaller self-governing regions. It's difficult to call these kingdoms in any real sense, as there was lots of infighting and alliances between different lords and their holdings. The main groups here were the Swedes, Svear, living in Svealand, and Geats, Götar, living in Götaland. The Geats can also be split into two groups, the Western Geats and the Eastern Geats. The Eastern Geats are sometimes referred to as Wolfings, the Wolf clan, in works like Beowulf. Here's some more complexity for you. The English term Swedes has two meanings in Swedish. As mentioned, Swedes can translate into Svear, referring to the people of Svealand. In most, if not all, international contexts, Swedes simply mean the citizens of the modern nation of Sweden. In this segment specifically, Swedes will mean the people of Svealand, and going forward in future episodes, it will mean the people of Sweden, the kingdom. And then there are the Geats. They are often, incorrectly, confused with Goths. No, not those Goths. These ones, like Visigoths and Ostrogoths. Those, though, were just terms that the Romans used for a large set of different peoples, but that's not the can of worms we're going to open here. Since the terms sound sort of similar, Geats and Goths, Götar and Goter, people have, throughout history, assumed a connection. From the Swedish Viking warrior perspective, being related to the people who sacked Rome is quite the boast. Research, however, does not support this claim, as no connection has been found between the groups. So the city of Göteborg should probably be called Gothenburg rather than Gothenburg in English, just to avoid such confusion. Swedes and Geats can be seen more as different clans or collections of clans rather than as different peoples or tribes. They spoke the same language, had the same beliefs, and interacted with each other a lot. We won't get into the nitty-gritty details here in this episode. Comment below if you would like to hear those details. But the first ruler to formally unite the Swedes and Geats under one crown was Olof Skötkonung around the year 995, a milestone in the formation of the Swedish kingdom. Similar to Norway, the unification would remain only a paper construct for centuries. For example, when King Erik Edvardsson attempted to strengthen royal authority, he was murdered for his efforts in Uppsala in 1160 by beheading. His head now adorns the coat of arms of Stockholm. even though he had nothing to do with the city and Stockholm wasn't even founded until a century after his death. But I digress. Someone who would succeed in unifying Sweden was Magnus Eriksson, ruling during the first half of the 1300s. And he wouldn't settle for just the crown of Sweden. Through inheritance, he also gained the crown of Norway. On top of that, he purchased Scania from Denmark, adding a third realm to his rule, a third crown. To symbolize this union, King Magnus introduced an emblem: three golden crowns on a blue background. This symbol, known as tre kronor, three crowns, would become, next to the national flag, the most recognizable emblem of Sweden. Today it adorns many Swedish institutions, including the police force, the prosecution authority, and even the national hockey team's jerseys. Imagine you're an ambitious ruler in medieval Europe, newly crowned and eager to secure your throne. Congratulations! But now the real challenge begins. How do you maintain control? How do you unify your realm? In the Middle Ages, rulers across Europe, including the Nordic kingdoms, turned to strategies like codifying laws, founding cities, and constructing castles to consolidate their power. In contrast, during the earlier Viking Age, justice in Scandinavia was highly localized. Communities gathered at regional assemblies known as tings, where a law speaker recited laws from memory. These laws varied from region to region and were not yet written down in any sort of formal codes. The shift from oral tradition to written law was a key step in centralizing authority and shaping the emerging medieval kingdoms of the north. At the core of this transformation was the establishment of kingdom wide law codes, which included statutes for marriage, inheritance, theft, murder, and more. One of the most important kings in Norwegian history, Magnus Håkonsson, made great efforts to modernize the Norwegian law codes. In 1274, his Landslov, the country code, was adopted by the Tings. The law code covered not only the mainland but also the Faroe Islands and Shetland, which were under Norwegian control at the time. All this work would give Magnus the epithet Lagaböte, the lawmender. The Landslov introduced the concept that crime is committed against the state rather than against the individual, and thus narrowed the possibilities for personal vengeance, a tradition that had been deeply rooted in the Viking Age. For Iceland, which was also ruled by Norway, Magnus drew up a modified version called Játensida, the Ironside. This was superseded only a few decades later in 1281 by Jonsbok, John's Book, a compilation of previously existing Icelandic laws put together by Jon Einarsson. Jonsbok would remain the basis of Icelandic law well into the 20th century. In Sweden, King Magnus Eriksson introduced the Landslag, which also translates into country law, around 1341. This comprehensive code replaced the older provincial laws that had governed different regions for centuries. Among its reforms were the abolition of thraldom, slavery, and restrictions on the nobility's ability to exploit the peasantry. In Denmark, legal centralization took a different form. The Jyske Law, the law of Jutland, was issued in 1241 by King Valdemar II. While not a kingdom-wide law code, it applied to Jutland, Fyn, and Schleswig, and became the model for later legal texts. Its famous preamble emphasized the importance of law as a foundation for justice and peace. These law codes did not apply to cities. They would have their own municipal laws. And speaking of cities, in the modern context, a city is simply a densely populated urban area. In the medieval context, a city was a center of power built around trade, guilds, and taxation. The size of the population wasn't really a factor. Cities, or towns, the terms are interchangeable in this context, were not just places where people lived, they were hubs of economic activity, legal autonomy, and royal influence. A ruler could either found new cities or give special urban privileges to already existing settlements, elevating their status to that of a city. These privileges included the right to hold markets and fairs, legal autonomy through the municipal laws, often known as city laws, and self governance through a city council or a magistrate. The oldest town in Scandinavia is believed to be Ribe in Denmark. Its roots go back to the early Viking Age, but it received formal city privileges in the early 13th century. Other early receivers of city rights were Viborg and Odense. København, Copenhagen, was founded in 1167 and granted city privileges in 1254. In Sweden, it's unclear which town was the very first, but one of the earliest was Sigtuna, founded around 980. Formal city privileges would come later in 1010. Other early towns are Skara and Lödöse. Birka, which we mentioned, was abandoned around 975, so it was never recognized as a city. Stockholm was founded in 1250 and received privileges at the same time. In Norway, Tønsberg is widely considered the oldest town, with urban development dating back to the 11th century. It was also the first to receive city privileges. Other early towns include Bergen and Oslo. Bergen would later become an important part of the Hanseatic trade network, but that's a story for the next episode. It's also worth noting that the idea of a capital city, an administrative center for the entire kingdom, would come later. During the Middle Ages, the king's court, including any administrative staff, typically moved with the king as he traveled. The city dwellers would also get a special role in Scandinavian society, as we'll see later in this episode. So, that's the cities. But how do you control the countryside? During the Viking Age, local power was held by jarls, regional lords who governed territories and led warriors. In the High Middle Ages, this role evolved into the more European style duke, and regions were reorganized into duchies, territorial units governed by noble families under royal authority. To physically enforce control and defend these territories, castles were built. These were not just military structures, but also administrative centers and symbols of feudal power. A good example is Älvsborg Castle, located here, on the narrow strip of coastline that Sweden held in the west at this time. Wedged between the realms of Norway and Denmark, it became a highly contested stronghold, changing hands multiple times throughout history due to its strategic importance. Alongside castles, manors served as the economic backbone of rural society, where peasants worked the land under the authority of local lords. Importantly, the population of the Nordic kingdoms would remain overwhelmingly rural until the late 19th or even mid 20th century, making these medieval structures and systems deeply influential for centuries. Another major center of power and influence during the Middle Ages was, of course, the Church. During the Middle Ages, Scandinavia gradually became part of the Western Catholic Church, aligning itself with Rome rather than the Eastern Orthodox Church, which gained influence in Eastern Europe. This religious shift wasn't just spiritual, it had profound political, cultural, and administrative consequences. In the early Middle Ages, the Viking Age, Scandinavia lay on the fringes of Christian Europe and was the target of missionary activity. This effort was led by the Archbishopric of Hamburg-Bremen, from which figures like Ansgar, known as the Apostle of the North, and Adam of Bremen set out to spread Christianity in the region. This spread was slow at first, with only occasional Scandinavians converting abroad and bringing the faith back home. This would change when the kings themselves started converting, turning Christianity into a tool of royal legitimacy and centralization. The first Scandinavian king to be baptized is traditionally believed to be Harald Bluetooth, whom we've covered before, in the 10th century. According to his Yellingstones, he made the Danes Christian. The stones also name him as king over Norway, but nothing about any conversion efforts in this area. The first Christian king of Norway would instead be Olaf Tryggvason. He was baptized in England in 995 before returning to Norway with a private force. He killed the ruling regent Håkon Jarl and was then elected king himself. He promoted the Christian faith, sometimes by the word, sometimes by the sword. The full conversion of Norway to Christianity would take place beyond his lifetime. In Sweden, Olof Skötkonung would be the first Christian king in the early 11th century. He supported the establishment of Christian institutions, including Sweden's first bishopric in Skara. Something all three kings had in common is that their conversions were likely driven more by political strategy than any personal religious conviction. As mentioned, the church and its faith were powerful tools for consolidating control. Tryggvason wasn't the only king to spread the faith by sword. You may hear the word crusade and think of knights fighting in the Holy Land, and while that is correct, those were far from the only crusades. Swedish kings led several crusades into pagan Finland, marking the beginning of Sweden's expansion into Finnish territory and its integration into the Christian world. Danish kings, like Valdemar II, led similar campaigns in the Baltic region. According to legend, Valdemar received a sign from God before the Battle of Lyndanisse in 1219, a Christian cross on a red background. This is the first recorded appearance of the Dannebog, the Danish flag. The Dannebog would go on to set the visual standard for the Nordic countries and even some regions beyond to adopt flags featuring a cross design. This style is now even known as a Nordic cross. The spread of Christianity also involved the building of churches and the integration of the Nordic kingdoms into the broader church hierarchy. At the most local level, this meant the establishment of parishes and parish churches, where communities gathered for worship, sermons, and news from the realm. Above the parishes were the bishoprics, each overseeing several parishes and led by a bishop. Near the top of the hierarchy, just below the Pope in Rome, were the archbishoprics, which supervised all bishoprics within a region. The first archbishopric of the Nordics was established in Lund in 1103, marking a major step in integrating Scandinavia into the Catholic Church's administrative structure. It also signaled that the region was now considered its own ecclesiastical province, no longer under the authority of Hamburg-Bremen. This shift gave the Nordic kingdoms greater religious autonomy and strengthened their ties to Rome. During the 12th century, Uppsala in Sweden and Nidaros, modern-day Trondheim in Norway, were also elevated to archbishoprics. The coming of Christianity also brought with it powerful monastic orders, such as the Cistercians. Originating in France and named after the monastery of Jeteau, the Cistercians established abbeys in places like Alvastra and Nydala in Sweden, as well as Esrum and Sörö in Denmark. These institutions were generously endowed with land by kings and nobles, becoming influential centers of both spiritual life and economic activity. Monasteries played a crucial role in preserving and promoting literacy in a largely illiterate society, serving as hubs of learning, manuscript production, and education. They also acted as vital links between the Nordic kingdoms and the broader Christian world, embedding the region more deeply into the cultural and intellectual currents of medieval Europe. Those who made a lasting impact on the Catholic faith could even be canonized. Canonized? What? Could you be shot out of a cannon or something? Nope, canons weren't invented yet, and that's canon with one N. It means you were officially declared a saint by the church, introduced into the canon of the church. Sweden, Norway, and Denmark each have one national saint: Saint Erik, Saint Olav, and Saint Knut. All three are known by the epithet the Holy in their local languages. So Saint Olav becomes Olav the Holy, Olav den Helige, for example. Unlike Olav and Knut, however, Erik would never be officially canonized by the Pope. His sainthood was based more on local veneration and not papal recognition. There are other examples of this kind of localized worship, such as Saint Botvid and Saint Helena of Skövde, who were revered in their regions but never formally canonized by Rome. The medieval era also gave birth to the strict social hierarchy of the estates of the realm. The first one was those who pray, the clergy, priests, monks. The second one was those who fight, the nobility, the knights. The third estate was those who work, everyone else. In general, the first two were tax exempt. The nobility was instead called on to provide knights to fight for the realm. This system, naturally, didn't look the same everywhere in Europe. Even up here in Scandinavia, it took on a few different forms. In Norway, all tax-paying classes, so peasants, tradesmen, craftsmen, and so on, were considered part of the third estate. The tiny nobility held power near that of the monarch, but Norway never developed a strong feudal system like elsewhere in Europe. Most farmers were freeholders, owning their land and enjoying a degree of autonomy rare in medieval Europe. In Denmark, only those who owned large tracts of land held any real influence. The non-land-owning poor were often completely excluded from the estates, meaning that they had no political power at all. These peasants were effectively serfs, tied to the land they worked and subject to the authority of the land-owning nobility. This system of land-bound peasantry would persist in Denmark for many centuries. Sweden would, instead of 3 estates, develop a system with 4. The first two were the clergy and nobility, like elsewhere in Europe, But the third estate would be the burghers, the urban merchants and craftsmen. And the fourth estate was the peasantry. Not every peasant in the realm was included here, only the land-owning, tax-paying ones. Like in Denmark, the unlanded peasants were not included and held no political power at all. But not everyone accepted the estate system quietly. Throughout the Middle Ages and beyond, peasant revolts erupted across Europe, including in Scandinavia, challenging the privileges of the nobility and the clergy. One quote, often repeated in Sweden, captured the spirit of the resistance. När Adam grävde och Eva spann, vem var då en adelsman? It's a reminder that before titles and estates, all people worked the land. And when the burden of taxes, labor, and injustice grew too heavy, the peasants sometimes rose up. Not just with words, but with pitchforks. The challenges and problems during the Middle Ages were not just caused by people. Some were seen as acts of God. We're now in the mid 14th century. There are dark clouds on the horizon, and the Grim Reaper is sharpening his scythe. We don't know exactly when and where the Black Death, or Black Plague, first entered Europe, but the prevailing theory is that it arrived through the port of Kaffa in Crimea around 1346. From there, it spread rapidly across the continent, and over the next decade, it would claim the lives of about a third of Europe's population. Young and old, peasant and noble, no one was safe from the touch of death. The plague was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. A common misconception is that it was spread by rats, but it was actually the fleas living on the rats that carried the bacteria and transmitted it to humans. The rather abysmal hygiene standards of the time didn't exactly help either. The plague came in three main forms. Bubonic plague, the most well-known form, marked by painful swelling, called buboes. It had a lethality rate of around 50 to 80%, so you at least stood a chance of surviving. Pneumonic plague affected the lungs, causing victims to cough up blood. The coughing also helped the disease to spread rapidly, especially in the cramped and unsanitary living conditions of medieval towns. It had a near 100% fatality rate. Septimetic plague, the deadliest form, infected the bloodstream. Victims developed bruise-like markings and often died within hours of the first symptoms. It was a guaranteed death sentence. As bad as you might think the corona pandemic was a few years ago, it doesn't hold half a candle to the calamity that was the Black Death. In its worst forms, you could eat breakfast with your family at home and dinner with St. Peter at the pearly gates. So, how did this thing affect the Nordic kingdoms? The plague would, as far as we know, first reach Norway in 1349 via a Hanseatic ship from England that docked in Bergen. The Norwegians who unloaded the ship fell ill, and the plague's grip on Norway became a grim reality. It's possible that the Oslo region in the east was hit earlier, but the sources are scarce. Equally scarce are the sources for Sweden, but we know that the plague was spreading through the kingdom in the spring of 1350. The plague would be locally known as Digerdöden, the Great Death. For Denmark, we mostly have folk tales. One tells of an abandoned Norwegian ship drifting ashore on the western coast of Jutland. Locals supposedly unloaded the cargo, unknowingly giving the plague a foothold in Denmark. Whether this actually happened is uncertain, but the plague likely arrived in Denmark somewhere between 1348 and 1350. The effects of the plague was similar to elsewhere in Europe. 30 to 40% of the population succumbed to the disease. Some areas were completely depopulated, while others seemed unaffected. Finland and the Sami regions, for example, appeared to have been spared, at least according to the limited sources that we have. People naturally wondered why this was happening and whether the end of days was approaching. Common explanations at the time included bad air, God's wrath, or, as tragically common in European history, the eternal scapegoats, the Jews. Desperate times bring desperate measures, and people did what they could to escape the plague. They sealed windows and doors, hoping to escape the bad air or miasma. They performed acts of penance, hoping to regain God's mercy. And in some places, they carried out violent persecutions against Jews, who were wrongfully accused of poisoning wells or spreading the disease. One person who had a lot to say about the suffering of her time was Heliga Birgitta, Saint Bridget of Sweden. Living through the Black Death, she saw the plague not as a random disaster, but as God's judgment on a sinful world. In her revelations, she wrote, "The world is full of sin, therefore it shall be purified by suffering." She believed that the pride of kings and the corruption of priests had brought ruin upon the people. And she didn't keep quiet about it. She spoke truth to power, confronting popes and monarchs demanding repentance and reform. Divine punishment or not, the Black Death would eventually burn itself out, and by the end of the 1350s, it was but a sad memory. Plagues would come and go through the centuries, but there would, so far at least, never again be anything like the Black Death. So, we're now entering the second half of the 14th century. Our young kingdoms have solidified and become powers of their own on the European stage. The Catholic Church now has a firm hold and has helped reshape Scandinavian society. We made it through the calamity of the Black Death. What follows now will be one of the first attempts of a unified Scandinavia. In the next episode, we will explore this union, the Kalmar Union. Thank you for watching.